Hey everyone, I'm Harvest Build Destroy, and this is usually a channel about real-time strategy games, but in this video I'm going to talk about Dark Souls. But I should note before I start that there will probably be some minor spoilers throughout this video, so proceed at your own caution. Anyway, as I mentioned in my last video, I've been playing a lot more From Software games than RTS for the past year or so, and it seems to me that a lot of other RTS players share my interest in these games, despite the fact that the two genres share basically nothing in common aside from difficulty. But maybe that's enough. I've always wanted to see a graph of the age distributions of every person to have ever beaten a Souls game. I've always sort of assumed that the average age of Dark Souls players was somewhat higher than your average modern blockbuster game, and at least anecdotally, that seems to be the case. If you Google average age of Dark Souls players, you'll find polls on forums and so on showing the average age to be mid to late 20s, with a decent amount of older teens, but hardly anyone under 16. This might say just as much about the websites in question as the games, but Dark Souls seems to have disproportionately resonated with people just old enough to remember a time when video games didn't hold your hand, while still appealing enough to the younger crowd to bring intentionally difficult games into the mainstream consciousness. To be fair though, Dark Souls creator Hidetaka Miyazaki has said that creating a difficult game wasn't his objective in and of itself, but rather that he wanted players to feel a sense of accomplishment as they progressed through the game. To me, this has always seemed rather obvious, but this is a point that often seems to be lost on people who dislike and/or dismiss difficult games as unnecessarily masochistic. I don't think the desire to play more difficult games comes from a masochistic place for the vast majority of players who like games like this, and it certainly doesn't in my case. I just think there are two completely different but equally valid ways to appreciate video games, which roughly correspond to the often maligned casual versus hardcore distinction. It might surprise you to find out that I actually both like and play quote-unquote casual games. If I were to compile a list of my favorite games of all time, after RTS games, Soulsborne, and Resident Evil 4, the Uncharted games would be pretty close to the top. But when I play Uncharted games, what I'm looking to get out of the experience is something fundamentally different. When I play Uncharted, I play on the default or even sometimes the easy difficulty setting and blitz through it like I'm Rambo. There are few things in video games I hate more than controlling a shooter with a gamepad, and I don't want difficulty to get in the way of experiencing the game's story. To me, the pacing is an important part of that experience, and dying more than once in a blue moon gets in the way of immersion. I do think dying once in a while is probably important though, if only to remind you that it's a video game that you're interacting with rather than just a long movie, but I'm not exactly playing Uncharted for its gameplay. There are other games that do third-person action and platforming much better, and if that was what I wanted, I would just play those games. The appeal of the franchise for me is experiencing a blockbuster action movie in the first person. Well, technically third person, but hopefully you get what I mean. So while I do like this sort of thing, the games that really capture my attention are the ones that challenge me. Maybe there's a story, and it's nice if it's good, but it doesn't have to matter too much in the same way that the gameplay doesn't have to matter too much in Uncharted or South Park Stick of Truth, since it's fundamentally probably not what you're playing those games for. One of the things I really appreciate about Dark Souls is that the lore is actually pretty well done, but the games don't beat you over the head with it. It's there to discover if you want to, but you can easily play through them knowing nothing beyond what you need to find the next place you're supposed to go. But even if you don't care about the lore or pay any attention to it as you play, I think it's still somewhat important, or if not the lore itself, at least the atmosphere it creates. It's the opposite of Uncharted, where the story is the main appeal, but it only works if the gameplay is tight enough to not get in its way. As great as Dark Souls gameplay is, I doubt it would have the same impact if the environments were all bright and primary color dominant, and the character models all looked like champions from League of Legends. The Soulsborne games buck another trend in modern gaming that I'm not particularly fond of. Dark Souls is the most convincing dark fantasy universe I can recall since Diablo 1. I used to be fairly convinced that for logistical reasons, it was almost impossible to have a truly great fantasy story in a video game. To put it simply, in fiction, the best fantasy universes make very selective uses of magic. Magic needs to be mysterious and awe-inspiring in order to have its intended impact. But in a video game, you need to be able to cast a bunch of flashy magic spells. Magic needs to follow a very clearly defined set of rules that you as a player can manipulate to overcome the game's challenges, and it can be kind of hard to square the circle between these two poles. But Dark Souls does a pretty damn good job of it. Like Diablo 1, it mostly does so by making the enemies fearsome and the odds overwhelming. You might have an array of powerful spells at your disposal, but if the enemies are grotesque and intimidating enough, the sense of mystery and dread that characterizes a lot of the best fantasy and fiction can still be salvaged to some extent. Part of this is pure math, that is, difficulty, and part is purely aesthetic. Artorias, Manus, and the Nameless King all look just as fearsome as they actually are to fight. The environments are dark and dingy, and the enemies often hellish. If you allow yourself to get backed into a corner, you're gonna get sliced to bits, and then you have to watch the 10 or 15 second long "you died" screen every time you die before the load screen even starts. I've always liked the way enemies continue to swing semi-mindlessly in the direction of your corpse after you die. It makes them feel like an undead horde that won't stop until you slay every last one of them. But of course, you're gonna run out of Estus eventually, so you'll need to rest at a bonfire, thus respawning them all. Welcome to Dark Souls. I'm not a fan of the whole zombie apocalypse phenomenon in general, but the enemies in Dark Souls are frightening enough that the lumbering beast thing works pretty well. Of course, none of this would matter if the gameplay itself wasn't so tight. As just about anyone who's ever said anything about Dark Souls has pointed out, when you die, it's usually because you fucked up. Emphasis on usually, though. The game has the odd glitch or finicky control thing, but generally speaking, if you know the environments and enemies and are comfortable enough with the controls, it was you and not the game that caused you to die. But if you don't know anything about Dark Souls, here's a quick rundown of how it works. It's an action RPG with a combat system that is vaguely in the lineage of Zelda Ocarina of Time, with a lock-on targeting system and all sorts of weapons, stats, and gear. You also have a stamina bar, which works a little bit like turbo in a sports game. Every action aside from walking costs stamina, including running, swinging your weapon, blocking, and rolling. If you run out of stamina, you won't be able to do any of these things for a few seconds, and if you were blocking at the time, your character will be stunned and vulnerable. Shields are fairly effective, especially when you first start playing a Dark Souls game, but over time you're likely to realize that not getting hit in the first place is always better than blocking. Rolling is a big deal in Dark Souls. If you want to drastically oversimplify things, you could say that all Dark Souls combat really is memorizing when to dodge and when to swing. Every enemy you kill gives you souls, which are both experience and money at the same time. But the thing is, you lose all your souls every time you die. You leave behind a mark on the ground called a blood stain, and if you can manage to get back to where you died, you can pick up your souls again, but if you die again before you retrieve them, they're gone forever. You spawn at bonfires, which are where you heal and level up your character, and if you want to buy something expensive from a merchant, you have to walk there from a bonfire carrying however many souls you need for it. When you first start playing a Dark Souls game, you'll feel compelled to return to a bonfire every time you have enough souls to level up, but as you become more experienced, you'll start to feel comfortable with the discomfort of carrying a large number of souls with you as you explore Lordran, Drang Lake, or Lothric. You'll start to realize that the fact that the stakes are so real is a decent part of what makes the game so satisfying to play. You might think this goes against what I said earlier about the desire to play games like this not coming from a masochistic place, but ultimately, the stakes aren't that high. Even if you lose all the souls gained from killing a boss, which doesn't respawn, you can always grind your way back to whatever you lost by killing mobs if you have the patience. If you persevere and get through the first hours of a Dark Souls game, sooner or later you'll realize that the difficulty of the games is greatly exaggerated. The stakes are high enough that every interaction in the game feels significant, but not so much so that you're constantly worried about permanently messing up your save file. If you understand your character's different stats and know the environments and enemies, the games really aren't that hard. I prefer the word challenging. Every obstacle in the game can be overcome with a bit of elbow grease. And if applying that level of effort to a video game seems like a waste of time to you, well, fair enough. Dark Souls probably isn't for you, but neither are RTS games, so you probably aren't watching this video anyway. But many people have beaten Dark Souls before, and you can too, especially if you're willing to grind extra levels. A few extra points in the health stat might allow you to take one extra hit from a boss that's giving you trouble, which might tip the scales in your favor as you get used to its moveset. On that note, here's a general pointer if you're playing Dark Souls for the first time. Regardless of which Dark Souls game you're playing, for at least half of the game, you really only need the minimum stats required to wield the weapons you're using. You'll get much more damage out of upgrading your weapon than you will from extra stats in strength or dexterity, so just focus on making your health and stamina bars as large as possible. Anyway, the point is, if you're stuck on a boss or even just an area, you can always grind extra levels. Even the hardest parts of the game can be trivialized by a large enough health bar. There's also the fact that at least Dark Souls 1 and 2 are fairly non-linear. If an area is giving you trouble, there are usually a couple of other areas you can go to instead, and between this and grinding extra levels, you'll rarely find yourself completely stuck. If you really want difficulty, play Sekiro, which is less of an RPG and more of a stealth action game. Sure, you can grind mobs to unlock your special abilities, but you have to kill bosses and mini-bosses to increase your attack and health respectively. I still haven't beaten the final boss or Demon of Hatred myself. Anyway, now that everyone is hopefully more or less up to speed, one of the most remarkable things to me about the Dark Souls games is how replayable they are, even once you know them inside and out. Playing through them with a different character build feels really different and satisfying. Facing their many bosses with different weapons and spells and so on is fun for its own sake. It can also be a lot of fun to play through the games with an intentionally suboptimal build or with certain arbitrary restrictions. For instance, I've been thinking about doing a Soul Level 1 playthrough of Dark Souls Remastered, possibly with commentary for YouTube. If you're unfamiliar, what I mean by a Soul Level 1 playthrough is playing through the entire game without leveling up your character once. To anyone who has quit the game an hour or two into it in frustration, this might seem impossible, but it's actually quite doable. Some players have even managed to beat the game without even getting hit, and someone has even beaten Dark Souls 2 without getting hit and without rolling, all in one take, live on stream. It's pretty amazing to see the level that some players have taken Dark Souls to. I've been particularly fascinated by the speedrunning community. The first time you play a Dark Souls game, it might take you 50 or even 100 hours to finish, and then you can go to YouTube and see someone beat it in a little over a half an hour. Players have figured out all sorts of ways to skip entire areas, kill threatening bosses in seconds, and other stuff you probably wouldn't have even thought was possible if you just played through the games once yourself semi-casually. I don't like how most speedruns rely on glitches, though. Just search Sen's Fortress Skip or Farron Keep Skip on YouTube if you want to see what I mean. To me, these sorts of skips are exploits that should be patched out of the games, rather than interesting ways to optimize your route through them. There's a big difference between these skips and rolling straight down to Pinwheel in the Catacombs, jumping over the staircase in the Silver Knight area of Anor Londo, or rolling off the elevator in Duke's Archives to skip the mandatory death sequence. For a more advanced example, check out this mini-skip from the speedrunner Elijaz, who throws a couple of starting gift black firebombs over the bridge in the Undead Burg in Dark Souls 1 to kill the undead merchant and get the residence key. There are all sorts of little skips like this in Dark Souls games, many of which are frame-specific and require a lot of practice to pull off consistently. Personally, I can't imagine choosing to put this level of dedication into a single-player rather than multiplayer game, but it's interesting to watch other people do it. I've managed to pull off the Duke's Archive skip once myself, and I can confirm that it's quite difficult, but that is at best an intermediate skip, and it took me a good 10 or 15 tries. Legitimate speedrunners can do much more difficult skips than that reliably on the first try. As for the differences between the games in the franchise, Dark Souls 1 seems to generally be accepted as the genre-defining masterpiece, and that's my view as well. I think the order you play them in matters, though. I could imagine someone who played Dark Souls 3 first thinking that some of the bosses in Dark Souls 1 are almost quaint by comparison. But the reason I prefer Dark Souls 1 isn't the combat system, the enemies, or the bosses, and I was old enough when I first played it that I don't think it's my favorite because of nostalgia either. The thing I really love about Dark Souls 1 is the interconnectedness of its world. There are only a couple of mandatory bottleneck areas that you have to clear before you can progress. For almost all of the game, there are multiple areas you can go to, in more or less whatever order you want. If you're having trouble with a boss, you can usually go somewhere else and come back when your character is a higher level. And as you progress through the game, you're always unlocking shortcuts to areas you've already been, which is good, because you don't unlock the ability to warp from bonfire to bonfire for quite a long time in Dark Souls 1, which, oddly enough, I actually kind of like. Though there are some shortcuts in the other games, they aren't as meaningful when you can warp anywhere you want right from the start of the game. If you stock up on Homeward Bones in those games, you can basically be where you want when you want, and I think this sort of detracts from the immersion and even the sense of accomplishment you get as you progress through the games. I've beaten Dark Souls 2 a couple of times, and yet I still forget how to get from zone to zone until I'm actually there, because you sort of don't need to memorize that. I think the warp mechanic comes into play right at the perfect time in Dark Souls 1. You've been playing the game for quite a while by then and know the drill, and you've just beaten your first big boy boss, or should I say bosses. The world opens up quite a bit at this point, and most of the paths you'll take lead to a dead end after you clear the final boss. You can't warp to every single bonfire either, so it's not like you're just hopping from bonfire to bonfire every few minutes anyway. Basically, by this point in the game, you've earned the right to warp around. The other two games don't feel quite the same for this reason, even though I still love them. Dark Souls 2 tends to be a polarizing game that some love and some hate, and personally I've never quite gotten the hate. I could understand thinking it's the weakest entry in the series, but I have a hard time imagining not liking it at all if you like the others. I guess I could imagine someone thinking that the non-Estus healing items trivialize the game's difficulty a bit, but some of the basic combat mechanics are more punishing to begin with. For example, enemies become much more aggressive if they see you healing, and your Estus takes much longer to replenish your health bar than it does in Dark Souls 1, or 3 for that matter. One of the most striking things about Dark Souls 2, though, is how long it is. It's close to twice as long as the other games, and many argue that it's oversaturated with forgettable bosses. I think there's some truth to that. When I think of the most memorable From Software bosses, I tend to think of ONS, Artorias, Manus, Calamite, Nameless King, Pontiff Sullivan, Ludwig, Orphan of Kos, and Guardian Ape before any of the bosses from Dark Souls 2 come to mind. But if you like Souls games in the first place, I still think it's hard to argue with an ultra-long game where you can New Game Plus individual areas at your leisure and respec as many times as you want. I usually burn out of Dark Souls 2 before I beat every single boss, but I'm glad they're all there. There are even a couple I've never beaten before because I always burn out before I get that far, but I'm actually okay with a Dark Souls game that's quote-unquote too long, especially if we never get a Dark Souls 4. As for Dark Souls 3, it certainly has the tightest melee combat in my view, but the fact that it's almost entirely linear really detracts from the experience for me. Dark Souls 2's world might not be as filled with shortcuts as Dark Souls 1, but at least it mimics its non-linear structure. Even though you can build your character in so many different ways, having to clear Dark Souls 3 in pretty much the same order every time really reduces its replay value for me. It's kind of a shame because the bosses and combat system are really great. It's also far and away the most active Dark Souls game in multiplayer, so if you're looking for PvP, you should probably be playing Dark Souls 3. I guess while I'm at it, I'll touch on Bloodborne and Sekiro. I haven't played enough of Demon Souls to say much about it, although oddly enough, it was the first one I bought and played before Dark Souls 1 was even out. Like most, my initial reaction to it was that it was a cool idea for a game, but excessively difficult to the point where I didn't really want to continue after an hour or two. For whatever reason, I haven't played it since, but I'm sure I will sooner or later. As for Bloodborne, I think it's great, but like Dark Souls 3, I feel like it has less replay value than I would like. Bloodborne significantly tones down the RPG elements of Dark Souls, which could just as easily be your reason for preferring it to Dark Souls, and fair enough, but for me it's the opposite. The combat is satisfying, the lore and atmosphere are really well done, and the bosses are excellent, but playing through the game multiple times with different builds doesn't seem as interesting to me. There's no equip load, and choosing what armor to wear is mostly cosmetic. You get the only set you really need early on, unless you want arcane defense or something like that. You also have access to one of the best weapons in the entire game, the saw cleaver, right at the start of the game, so it's almost hard to justify doing anything other than a strength, skill, equality build and using the saw cleaver for the whole playthrough. This is what Bloodborne speedrunners do. But for a first playthrough, Bloodborne might be my second favorite From Software game, and I'm positive that I'll play it again someday. Actually, I feel like I have to, since I never beat Orphan of Kos, and consequently never even got to fight Lawrence the First Vicar. I feel similarly about Sekiro. It's awesome, but its lack of RPG mechanics limits its replay value for me, at least compared to Dark Souls. Still, I thought the stealth twist on Soulsborne gameplay was really fun and satisfying, and Guardian Ape is a legitimate contender for my favorite From Software boss. I love the way parrying works in Sekiro too. I almost never used to parry in Dark Souls or even Bloodborne, but you basically can't not parry in Sekiro. It's less punishing, but just as satisfying when you pull it off. If, like myself, you've played through multiple Soulsborne games without ever bothering to parry, you might find that Sekiro changes the way you look at From Software games, and makes you want to play through Dark Souls again with a buckler or cestus in your offhand. But despite being a pretty big fan of From Software games in general, and especially Dark Souls 1, there are a few ways in which I've always felt like the games don't realize their full potential. The game's multiplayer modes have always felt a bit like afterthoughts, or if not that, like they were designed more to enhance the single-player experience than to be legitimate modes in their own right. Before I continue, I should probably point out that the majority of my experience with Dark Souls has been purely single-player. Up until recently, I had only played Dark Souls on a PlayStation that wasn't hooked up to the internet. I've really only been delving into Dark Souls multiplayer quite recently, so what follows are just my preliminary thoughts on the Dark Souls multiplayer experience. I plan to make another, more in-depth video on Dark Souls multiplayer at some point in the future, but so far, my impression is that there isn't quite as much endgame content as I would have liked. While there are arena-style multiplayer matchmaking modes in Dark Souls games, they're pretty bare bones. You have a couple of choices of game mode and map, but that's about it. Personally, I would have liked to see more elaborate PvP options like Battlegrounds in World of Warcraft, or at least a wider variety of maps to play on. Using the environment to your advantage is a big part of Dark Souls, and it would be nice to have more of an opportunity to do that in the game's proper, even playing field multiplayer modes. As it stands, the arena modes are hardly the main multiplayer modes in Dark Souls. The main multiplayer modes in Dark Souls are invasions and co-op. Co-op is pretty simple. If you're in human form, you'll see summon signs throughout the world as you play, usually near bosses. When you stand on a summon sign, you'll see a silhouette of the player available to summon, and if you choose to summon them, they'll appear in your world as a white phantom, and can follow you around and help you either until you die, defeat a boss, or move to a new area. If you want to play the whole game co-op with a friend, one of you will have to resummon the other many, many times. I've always wished there was a proper co-op mode in the games that didn't involve constant resummonings. I think it would be fun to play all the way to the end of New Game Plus 7 with a friend. The current co-op mode feels more like a difficulty modifier than anything. If you can't beat a boss, you can always just summon someone else who can. You can also be invaded by other players while you're in human form, in which case they appear in your world as a hostile red phantom. The mobs in your game world won't attack the invading player, which they can use to their advantage, although in my experience, more often than not, they don't. Some players will try to hide and ambush you, or use the mobs to help them kill you, but most of the time, players will wait for you to kill the mobs, and then the two of you will find an open space for a duel. As a general rule, you're allowed to apply your buffs and heal before the duel starts, but after it starts, it's considered bad etiquette to heal. I've never liked this unwritten rule myself, but since the invading player doesn't spawn with as many Estus, I guess it kinda makes sense. I'm not a big fan of invasion duels in general. It can take quite a while to clear an area for a duel, and the duel can be over in seconds. If you want a clean duel, I think you should just play the arena modes. I prefer invasions to embrace the chaos. As for how to invade, you'll find a decent handful of the main invasion item, the cracked red eye orb, as you play through the game, which are one-time use items that allow you to invade another player's world. Aside from cracked red eye orbs, you can invade other players' worlds by joining covenants. Covenants are sort of like in-game clubs that give you access to special perks and gear, and generally have some multiplayer function. For example, one of the more fun covenants in Dark Souls 1 is the Forest Hunter Covenant, which you join by talking to the cat in Darkroot Forest. Once you join the covenant, you're given a ring. If you wear the ring, you're added to a queue, and if there are players walking through the forest in human form, players in the Covenant queue will automatically invade them. This can be fun, although you're fairly likely to run into more than the occasional twink. If you're unfamiliar, a twink is a character that stops leveling at a certain point in order to be perfectly optimized for a specific lower level task. If a twink character plays through the whole game, perhaps with the help of co-op players, they can generally obtain gear, spells, etc. that can make them considerably stronger than players in the same area playing through the game more normally. I guess this sort of thing is almost inevitable, but it seems to me that Dark Souls has always had a pretty significant problem with both exploits and straight-up cheating. There are specific level and gear rules for invasions, but once players know them, they'll use them to their advantage and create the strongest possible characters for a specific covenant. Anyway, so while invasion gameplay can be fun, to me it feels more like a neat distraction that adds extra weight to the largely single-player experience, and co-op as it currently works feels similar in this regard. The overall Dark Souls formula is so solid that if there was a bit more for you to do in the endgame after beating the core single-player game, its replay value could be all but infinite. As I mentioned, a more fleshed out set of PvP modes is one example, but I also think even just a bit more attention to the game's New Game Plus modes could go a long way toward this end. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of New Game Plus, once you beat the game, it restarts and all the enemies are stronger. You can do this up to 7 times in Dark Souls, but how it works is a bit different in each game. In Dark Souls 1, the entire game switches over to New Game Plus once you beat the final boss and watch the end credits. In Dark Souls 2, you use an item called a Bonfire Ascetic to convert individual areas to New Game Plus. In Dark Souls 3, you unlock the ability to start the whole game over after beating the final boss, but you can choose to do it whenever you want. So if there are optional bosses you never beat, items you never found, etc., you still have the chance to tie up all the loose ends. But there isn't much that's terribly different in New Game Plus. A few of the items are different, but the enemies aren't. Changing up the distributions of enemies in the different areas, along with more elaborate changes in item locations, could have given players the incentive to explore every nook and cranny of the game world, in addition to breathing orders of magnitude more life into the invasion and co-op modes. On the bright side though, there are mods for this sort of thing, at least for the PC versions. The Daughters of Ash mod for Dark Souls 1 is a pretty elaborate remake that does something pretty similar to what I would have liked to see out of New Game Plus. There are also enemy and item randomizers, boss rush modes, and so on out there to shake things up. But I would have liked to see these sorts of things in the game in the first place with official support. A sandbox mode would have been cool too. I think it would be a lot of fun if you could create your own scenarios and drop in whatever combination of enemies you want in whatever area you want, and then try to take them on with whatever combination of item and stats, either solo or co-op. The possibilities with this sort of mode would be literally endless. But maybe I'm asking too much of a game I already consider to be among the greatest ever made. After all, From Software already had trouble finishing the Lost Izalith section of Dark Souls 1 on time. Even as they are, the Dark Souls games are highly replayable 50-hour plus experiences with a fair amount to do in the endgame. It's been a hell of a long time since I found a game franchise I like this much for its gameplay rather than its story. But that's about all I have to say about Dark Souls for now. Like I said, I'm still somewhat new to Dark Souls multiplayer, and I plan to make another video on that topic at some point. But first I need to play more Dark Souls multiplayer, which, in the lull before Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition comes out, I plan to do quite a lot of. But that's all for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and remember to rate, subscribe, hit the bell, and all that. See you soon.